Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, back with another Market Watch episode. So today we're actually just going to be looking at some cards that had my attention following the UDS event this past weekend. Now, some of these cards might be cards that we've talked about before already, but I think they're definitely important to highlight because the event definitely solidified what a lot of the meta is going to look like moving forward. Now, of course, we do have to keep in mind that the lists were constructed with the idea that they weren't going to have to play against any rogue or anything like that, so very heavily catered to the mirror match, but the lists will definitely be something for us to go off of as we look towards YCS Las Vegas, and the cards we're talking about today are definitely some of the ones you guys should be paying attention to. Let's get started. Alright, now starting off with a couple of cards that we've talked about not that long ago, beginning with psy-frame gear Delta. Delta is the spell negate version of Gamma, being able to negate almost any activated spell card while summoning itself and a driver. This is a tech that had become very popular in the OCG, and we've actually now seen that carry over to the TCG as well. It's able to hit key cards such as Wanted, Bonfire, Talents, and Sinful Spoils, so it can be really devastating, especially if you combine it with another hand trap like a Droll and Lockbird. Now here, Jesse Cotton ran 3 copies of Delta in his side deck, and it actually came up really clutch for him a couple of times on stream. With a success that Jesse saw this past weekend, winning the whole event, it's inevitable that a bunch of players are now going to be jumping on Delta as well and adding it into their sideboards, and I do think that this is going to be one of the most highly sought after cards between now and YCS Las Vegas. We looked at this card when it was around $10, but it has actually done nothing but go up since, and it's literally almost a $20 card right now as of when I'm making this video, with only 9 listings up and barely any verified sellers online. It shouldn't be that surprising since it's a card with only 1 printing from back in High Speed Riders. This card wasn't in OTS Tournament Pack 24, and we don't have any reprint sets coming soon. It's looking like this card's going to be very in demand and difficult to find and expensive until we get a reprint of it in something like hopefully Rarity Collection 2 or OTS 25. The other card that we're covering again is Crosso Designator. This is a card that I'm glad is finally having its chance to shine. It's something that was really hyped up and useful over in the OCG. In fact, it was eventually limited to 1 and remains limited over there, whereas here in the TCG the card has barely seen any sort of meta relevance since its release. Now, however, the card is proving to be extremely useful in the current format, given the dominance of Snake Eye Fire Kings. On one hand, it's able to shut off hand traps dealing with cards like Nibiru and Impermanence and Droll and Lockbird, to ensure that your combos go through and your boards remain intact. But on the other hand, with so many players using the deck and so many of the same cards, it can actually turn off key engine cards itself as well. The card had quite a showing this weekend. Jesse Cotton main decked 3 copies, while both Juan and Cameron ran 3 copies in the sideboard as well. They were 2nd and I believe 3rd or 4th place finishers. As a result, we are seeing a ton of copies moving off of TCG Player. The card was at around $14 to $15, but now both the Ultra and Secret are up to $18 or so, very close to hitting that $20 mark, and a ton of sold listings as well. With just the 2 printings, I guess it isn't a huge surprise that the card has gotten so expensive. I think at one point you could have grabbed this card for only $8 to $10. Hopefully you guys have your sets already. The fear here is that the card may be included in Rarity Collection 2, which will naturally tank the price down quite a bit. So you guys will definitely want to just hold on to a set for yourselves to use, but look to offload any other copies that you may have. Alright, the next card I want to mention is Divine Temple of the Snake Eye. This is of course the Snake Eye field spell, and it's a pretty cool one. I think that prior to the event some players were sort of iffy on it. It was like an optional one of that some players could choose to run, but it wasn't really deemed necessary. However, the card was absolutely everywhere at the UDS. There was a surprising amount of pure Snake Eye, which definitely runs this card at 1, but even most of the Fire King Snake Eye builds were using this card as well. Now on activation, it lets you spell trap zone one of your Snake Eye monsters. I believe that's typically going to be Oak, so that you can send it off with your Ash and then revive it later on if necessary. But also, Divine Temple has an effect where if your opponent summons a monster while this is up, you can special summon one of your monsters, being treated as a continuous spell. So this lets you do more things if you get hit by a Nibiru, Gamma, or Delta. And it's also a spell effect, so if it's just during your opponent's turn, this means that you won't play into Talents. That said, Divine Temple saw a ton of copies move on TCG Player this weekend. It's really a pretty cheap card, and its price didn't move all that much. I think it was like $1.50 or so before, and now it's maybe a $2 card. This is because it's from a relatively new set and the card is actually never run at more than 1. However, there's definitely going to be people looking for this card at your locals and such, so if you have them at home, load them into your binder and see if you can offload them while people are so actively looking for the card. Moving on, I feel like Dark the Dark Charmer Gloomy is actually a card that's worth paying attention to. Dark doesn't do anything different from the other Charmers, it just happens that it interacts with Dark monsters, which are some of the most prevalent in the game. Of course, this lets you steal a Dark monster out of your opponent's graveyard, and if it's destroyed by your opponent's card effect, it lets you search your deck for a Dark monster with 1500 or less defense. This card is basically a staple in the extra deck right now. It lets you steal a monster from your opponent's graveyard, so something like a Dia Bellstar where you would get its effect, allowing you to link climb into a Promethean Princess or Selene. If you're running Snake Eye Fire Kings this format, Dark is definitely a card that you should be including in the extra deck. The reason we're talking about this card is that there's actually been a ton of copies of Dark moving on TCG Player over the weekend. The two accessible printings of this card are the original super rare from Battle of Chaos and then the ultra rare reprint in the tins. With these two printings, I think the expectation is that this card would basically just be a bulk card. However, I do think it's worth noting that these are actually $1.50 to $2 each as well, which is pretty good for a card that a lot of players will disregard. Not the biggest thing, but just like with Divine Temple, this is a card that players are going to be actively hunting down, and a lot of people won't think to bring a card like this in their trade binder to locals. Load up on these and see if you can convert them into something that has a bit more of a stable value. Okay, so this is a bit of an odd one. It's Sinful Spoils of Subversion, another Snake Eye spell card. This is one that I don't think sees very much play at all. It's not nearly as important as the field spell or original Sinful Spoils. However, this is a card that Jesse Cotton actually chose to run a single copy of in his side deck. Its effect is pretty simple. It lets you target a face-up monster on the field and push it back into the spell trap zone as a continuous spell. This is an alternative that can be searched off of Poplar, maybe if you've already gone through Divine Temple and Original but you still want to be able to resolve Poplar's effect. This card is non-destruction removal, which in the mirror match can be really important since it won't let your opponent trigger certain effects. The other cool thing that I learned about this weekend is that if you push a Mirror Jade into the spell trap zone, your opponent can't actually summon another one since the one in the spell trap zone still counts as controlling one. The final thing is that Flamberge can summon monsters from your opponent's spell trap zone, so you're basically using this card to set it up and then steal it later on. This card is a little bit older, coming out in Duelist Nexus, the set before Age of Overlord. It's never actually been meta relevant. The secrets aren't too expensive, they're around $7 to $8, which is a little bit high, but I guess I understand because of all the hype around Snake Eye, and also Duelist Nexus wasn't too great of a set value-wise. I think that this is a card that's going to grow on people, and I think it'll be even more useful after some of the Fire King cards get hit, and we see a bit more of a shift towards the pure Snake Eye deck. Remember that Duelist Nexus should be in the 2024 tins though, so don't go too crazy on this card, but if you can pick it up for around $4 to $5, I think it's not a bad card to hold on to a set of. Alright, the last two cards are things I'm a bit more speculative about. The first one is Gurura, Wings of Resonant Life. So by now you guys know what Gurura is. It's probably one of the best super polymerization targets ever printed, and on top of that, it lets you draw a card if it ever hits the graveyard. This is something that's been in demand ever since its release. It's actually one of the relatively more expensive ultras that we've seen from a core set when it was at its peak. At the moment, either the secret or ultra rare version of Gurura is sitting at $16 to $18. The card has actually been on an upward trend over the last few months, and this is the highest price that the card has been ever since we got its Megaton reprint. However, this is where I think I'm going to take a bit of a weird stance and say that I think Gurura is now actually a sell. I think that in terms of value within the game, Gurura and Super Poly aren't that great right now. Snake Eye Fire Kings and Pure Snake Eye don't have room in the extra deck for Super Poly targets, which is why none of the 3 lists in the top 4 used it. The one deck that did use Super Poly was the Branded player, and even then, he didn't have Gurura in his extra deck at all. His only Super Poly target was the Mud Dragon. Maybe there's a case to be made for Gurura being stronger in an event with more rogue decks, but I don't think that's the way to approach it in a tier 0 format like this. And yes, the card is still useful in some decks that want to run Nadir Servant packages and stuff, but I don't think that those should be the main concern. On top of that, I don't know why, I feel like Gura is the sort of card that Konami would opt to reprint in Rarity Collection 2, though I don't have any evidence to support that. It's more of just like a feeling. I think that having 1 or 3 copies of Gura is great. They're a good card to use, and it's something that you'll want to have access to in the future. I still have my set and I have no intention of moving it, but I think that any copies that you have beyond that, now might be the best time to dump them while the card's price is relatively high. And finally, there's one last card for us to look at, and it's a new one out of Phantom Nightmare called EMP Meow Mine. This card is a pretty simple generic monster. If there's a Link monster on the field or in either graveyard, you can special summon this card for free. And if a Link 2 that you control is sent to the graveyard or banished face up, you banish this card from your graveyard or hand to bounce an opponent's card. I think that this is really cool and has a lot of potential. It's just not this card's time quite yet. Now, as far as results go, I think there was actually a plant list that was maybe topping a regional or something like that ran 3 copies of this card. I don't know, I looked at it, it seemed really out of place, but I guess it worked for that person, so why not? Anyways, I bring this card up because I actually noticed that this is starting to move up price-wise. This card was only $2 or so, but it's now actually up to almost $4 per copy on TCG Player. So basically a double up on a card that isn't seeing any sort of competitive play at the moment. I would understand if this was like a fire monster, and I guess maybe it's possible that Snake Eye Fire King is still going to look at something like this, kind of like how they look at Subversion, where they're playing cards that provide non-destruction removal. I'm not too sure. The other thing we have to consider is that Phantom Nightmare is just so starved for value that players are looking for the best possible cards to hype up, and one of them just happens to be Meow Mine. Anyways guys, if you do know exactly why it is that there's a specific reason for this card trending upwards, make sure that you all let us know in the comment section down below. Alright guys, that is all we have for today's episode. The UDS event I think was really cool. It's kind of interesting that it happened at the beginning of a format rather than at the end. I think we all sort of knew that Snake Eye Fire King was going to be dominant, but it was certainly interesting to watch the games play out, and it really showcased just how amazing some of these players actually are. Anyways guys, if you did enjoy today's Market Watch, please make sure you let me know by hitting that thumbs up button. Make sure you leave a comment in the comment section down below. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and until next time guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.